Griselda Blanco was born on February 15, 1943, in Cartagena, Colombia, but her formative years were spent in the crime-ridden slums of Medellín. From the very beginning, her life was shaped by poverty, violence, and survival. Medellín in the 1940s and 1950s was not yet the international drug capital it would later become, but it was already marked by crime, political instability, and social unrest. For a child like Griselda, opportunities were limited, and survival often depended on learning the ruthless codes of the street. Her mother, Ana Lucia Restrepo, moved with young Griselda to Medellín when she was just 3 years old. The relationship between mother and daughter was harsh, unforgiving, and filled with abuse. Ana Lucia worked as a sex worker and struggled to provide stability. Instead of warmth and protection, Griselda received harsh discipline and neglect. By the time she was a young girl, she was already exposed to the underbelly of Medellín's slum life, brothels, criminals, and an atmosphere where violence was a normal part of daily existence. It was in this environment that Griselda began her criminal journey. At just 11 years old, she was already involved in petty crimes. Stories circulate from Medellín that she once kidnapped a wealthy neighborhood boy for ransom. When his family refused to pay, she allegedly shot him dead without hesitation. Whether fully accurate or exaggerated by legend, this story captures the brutal reputation she developed early in life. By her early teens, she had become feared by other children in the neighborhood, a girl whose temper and violence made her stand out even in a city where crime was common. Medellín's slums taught Griselda the rules of survival: never show weakness, always strike first, and use fear to gain control. These lessons would stay with her for life and define the empire she would later build. By the age of 13 or 14, she was already involved in pickpocketing, prostitution, and small-time hustling. She quickly learned how to manipulate men, how to use charm when necessary, and how to use violence when charm failed. Her teenage years were marked by associations with older criminals who saw her potential. Unlike many young women of her time, Griselda had no interest in traditional roles of marriage and domesticity. Instead, she sought power and independence, even if that meant aligning herself with dangerous men. Her relationships in Medellín were transactional, serving her needs for protection, resources, and access to criminal networks. One of the defining traits of Griselda Blanco was her extraordinary ability to adapt and learn from her environment. The Medellín of her youth was filled with black markets and contraband smuggling. Cigarettes, liquor, and other goods often entered illegally through Colombia's ports, and local gangs profited from distributing them. Griselda observed how these networks operated and how violence was used to control territory. While still very young, she absorbed the methods of intimidation, bribery, and secrecy that would later become tools in her international empire. But perhaps the most important influence on her was Medellín's deep culture of violence. Colombia during this era was engulfed in La Violencia, a brutal civil conflict between liberal and conservative parties that killed hundreds of thousands. Although the conflict was largely political, its impact filtered into everyday life, especially in the poor neighborhoods. Gunfire, killings, and lawlessness were part of the background noise of Griselda's childhood. For her, murder and bloodshed were not shocking. They were normalized. By the late 1950s, Griselda was no longer just a troubled teenager. She was already a hardened criminal in her own right. She was known for carrying a gun, threatening rivals, and stealing without remorse. Her reputation grew in Medellín's underworld as someone ruthless far beyond her years. While most young girls of her age were dreaming of marriage, school, or escape, Griselda was planning bigger things. Around this time, she also became involved with her first husband, Carlos Trujillo, a small-time criminal. Their marriage was less about love and more about survival and shared ambition. Carlos introduced her to more serious criminal opportunities, but Griselda quickly showed she had her own ideas. She was not content to be the wife of a hustler. She wanted to lead, to control, and to build something larger. By the end of the 1950s, Griselda Blanco had already transformed from an abused child into a rising force in Medellín's criminal scene. Her childhood taught her the value of fear, the use of violence, and the art of manipulation. These lessons, forged in poverty and blood, would serve as the foundation for the empire she would one day rule across 2 continents. Her journey from the slums of Medellín was only beginning. Soon, she would take her ambitions far beyond Colombia, carrying with her the scars of her brutal upbringing and the drive to seize power at any cost. By the early 1960s, Griselda Blanco was no longer the street girl of Medellín's slums. She had grown into a young woman hardened by violence, crime, and constant survival. At just 17, she was already deeply entangled in criminal life. Her early marriage to Carlos Trujillo gave her access to wider networks of thieves and smugglers. But Griselda quickly revealed she had ambitions far beyond her husband's limited operations. Carlos Trujillo was a small, time forger and petty criminal who specialized in creating fake immigration documents. He wasn't a powerful man, but he provided Griselda with her first glimpse into how crime could be scaled into something larger. Together, they started small hustles, moving stolen goods and working scams in Medellín. Yet, even in this partnership, Griselda's violent and controlling nature stood out. When disagreements arose, it was often Griselda, not Carlos, who dictated the terms. Her appetite for danger and risk was greater than his. Rumors from Medellín's underworld suggest that Griselda had little patience for Trujillo's lack of ambition. Over time, her frustration with him grew, and their marriage turned volatile. Their union, however, produced 3 children, all boys. Even as a young mother, Griselda showed little resemblance to the nurturing women of her neighborhood. She cared for her children in her own way, but survival and power remained her primary goals. It was during this period that Griselda and Carlos became involved in a crucial opportunity: illegal migration to the United States. At the time, Colombian smugglers had begun to see New York City as fertile ground. Immigrants needed fake documents, criminal groups needed couriers, and contraband of all kinds could be slipped through ports and airports. Trujillo's skills in forging documents and Blanco's fearlessness in risk-taking made them a natural pair for this emerging underworld economy. By the mid-1960s, Griselda made the life-changing move to the United States. With Carlos and her 3 sons, she settled in Queens, New York. To many Colombian immigrants, this was a chance at a better life, but for Griselda, it was the chance to expand her criminal career. She arrived in New York with little money, but an instinct for survival and an iron will to climb higher. Queens during the 1960s was a melting pot of immigrants. Italians, Irish, Puerto Ricans, and Colombians were carving out their places. Alongside the working-class families, there was also a thriving criminal underworld. Organized crime was dominated by Italian, American mafia families, but smaller ethnic groups, including Colombians, found ways to operate in the shadows. It was here that Griselda began building the foundation of her empire. At first, she lived modestly, working odd jobs and hustling on the side. But her real income came from fraud and contraband. With Carlos still forging documents, Griselda began developing contacts among Colombian immigrants desperate for fake visas and papers. She quickly learned that deception and intimidation worked just as well in New York as in Medellín. Yet her ambitions were far larger than document forgery. She began to experiment with small-scale drug trafficking, smuggling marijuana, and eventually cocaine into the city. At that time, cocaine was not yet the billion-dollar industry it would later become. In the 1960s, it was still seen as a glamorous but rare drug for the wealthy. Only a few visionaries saw its potential to explode into mainstream demand, and Griselda was one of them. Her ability to spot opportunities set her apart. While many Colombians in New York focused on petty hustles, Griselda was already thinking about networks, supply chains, and distribution systems. She realized that if she could control the routes from Colombia to the United States, she could build something far bigger than anything she had known in Medellín. But as her empire began to take shape, her personal life was again marked by violence. Her marriage to Carlos Trujillo deteriorated. The details are murky, but it is widely believed that Griselda eventually had him killed. Some accounts suggest she grew tired of his lack of ambition. Others claim he crossed her in business. Regardless of the reason, Carlos Trujillo disappeared, and Griselda was free to pursue her vision without him. By her early 20s, Griselda was a widow, whether by circumstance or by her own design, and a single mother of 3 boys in Queens. Most women in her situation would have struggled just to survive. But for Griselda, this was an opportunity. Without Carlos, she no longer had to share power. She was in charge of her own destiny. Around this time, she met her second husband, Alberto Bravo, a drug trafficker who played a pivotal role in her rise. With Bravo, Griselda finally found a partner whose ambitions matched her own. Together, they began building more sophisticated drug smuggling operations. Using Bravo's contacts and Griselda's ruthlessness, they started importing larger quantities of cocaine into New York. What set Griselda apart from others was her creativity in smuggling. She began designing methods that would become infamous in the years to come. One of her earliest innovations was custom-made underwear with hidden compartments, worn by women couriers to slip cocaine through airports undetected. Later, she would even use children as mules, sewing drugs into their clothing or hiding packages in strollers. These brutal but effective tactics reflected her willingness to do whatever it took to expand her reach. By the late 1960s, Griselda Blanco had firmly established herself in New York's underground. She was no longer a poor girl from Medellín's slums, but a rising figure in the drug world. Her reputation for violence and cunning spread quickly. Even in her 20s, people learned to fear her. Disloyal couriers or partners often vanished, and whispers of her involvement in murders surrounded her. The United States for Griselda was not just a new home, it was a new battlefield. Here, she would sharpen her skills, build her networks, and lay the groundwork for becoming the Cocaine Godmother. Her early years in New York were just the beginning. The small smuggling operations she ran with Alberto Bravo would soon grow into international pipelines. And the city of Miami, still years away from its cocaine wars, was waiting for her arrival. The girl from Medellín had transformed into a woman of ambition, violence, and vision. In the streets of Queens, she began her climb to power, one ruthless step at a time. By the dawn of the 1970s, New York City was changing, and so was Griselda Blanco. The city was a powder keg of crime, corruption, and opportunity. Organized crime families controlled unions, gambling, and drug distribution, while immigrant gangs carved out their own territories in neighborhoods across the boroughs. For a woman like Griselda, who had already proven she was willing to kill, manipulate, and innovate, The stage was set for her to rise higher than anyone expected. With her partner and second husband, Alberto Bravo, she had already begun to move cocaine from Colombia to the United States. But the early 1970s were when their operations truly took shape. Cocaine, once considered a luxury for the rich, was starting to explode in popularity. The drug was becoming the choice of celebrities, Wall Street bankers, and nightclubs. The demand was growing rapidly, and Griselda recognized that she was standing at the edge of a gold mine. Unlike many small time dealers who focused on street-level sales, Griselda thought in terms of infrastructure. She wasn't interested in selling tiny amounts on corners. She wanted to control the supply chain itself, from the coca fields of Colombia to the dealers in New York. With Bravo's help, she established strong connections with producers in Colombia. These farmers and traffickers saw in her a woman who was as ruthless and reliable as any man in the business. In return, she gave them something invaluable: access to a booming U.S. market. Her smuggling methods became more sophisticated. Couriers, known as mules, were trained, equipped, and sometimes even threatened into obedience. Griselda designed lingerie and brass with hidden compartments for women couriers to carry cocaine through airports. She had suitcases fitted with false bottoms, and even used children's toys and household goods to hide the drug. Nothing was off limits if it meant her product could pass undetected. But what truly made Griselda different from other traffickers was her violent enforcement of loyalty. She was not just a businesswoman, she was a dictator in her empire. Anyone who betrayed her, stole from her, or even failed her could expect brutal consequences. Rumors spread through Queens and Brooklyn about her ruthlessness. Associates whispered about bodies found in alleyways, rivals shot in broad daylight, and sudden disappearances linked to her network. These stories weren't exaggerations, they were warnings. During this time, Griselda also began building a network of distributors in New York. Many were Colombian immigrants like herself, but she was not afraid to work with Puerto Rican, Dominican, and even Italian, American associates if it expanded her reach. She learned how to navigate the power dynamics of the city, where mafia families still dominated parts of the drug trade. But unlike other Colombians who bowed to the mafia, Griselda carved her own lane. She was too ruthless, too independent, and too ambitious to serve as anyone's subordinate. Her marriage with Alberto Bravo was both a partnership and a storm. Together, they grew rich, living in relative luxury compared to the poverty of Medellín. Expensive clothes, jewelry, and high-end apartments became part of their world. But the wealth came with constant paranoia. Police crackdowns in New York were intensifying, and rival groups wanted a piece of the booming cocaine trade. Griselda's name was whispered among investigators, though for a time she managed to stay out of their direct reach. The early 1970s also marked the beginning of her reputation as La Madrina, the Godmother. This title was not one she claimed openly, but one given to her by those who both feared and respected her. In a criminal underworld dominated by men, she stood out as a woman who not only survived but dominated. Her fearlessness, combined with her willingness to order killings without hesitation, cemented her as a figure of authority. But success came with complications. The more cocaine flowed into New York, the more attention law enforcement paid to Colombian traffickers. The Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, was formed in 1973, and by then, Griselda was already on their radar. Agents in Queens and Manhattan began connecting dots between Colombian networks and the rising supply of cocaine on the streets. Still, her operations were sophisticated enough to evade direct exposure. Behind the curtain of wealth and power, Griselda's personal life was unraveling. Her marriage to Alberto Bravo grew tense. Some say she suspected him of skimming profits from their business. Others believe the tension came from her increasingly uncontrollable temper. Griselda had always demanded absolute loyalty, and when she sensed betrayal, her response was almost always violent. By the mid-1970s, her empire in New York had expanded beyond what many imagined possible. Estimates suggest she was moving hundreds of kilos of cocaine annually, generating millions of dollars in profits. She had established herself as a central figure in the cocaine pipeline between Colombia and the United States. Yet, with growth came enemies. Rival traffickers, law enforcement, and even her own husband were becoming obstacles in her path. The climax of this period came in 1975, when tensions between Griselda and Alberto Bravo erupted. She accused him of stealing millions from their operation. What followed has become the stuff of legend. Meeting in a Bogota nightclub parking lot, Griselda confronted Bravo. Words turned to violence, and in a hail of bullets, Bravo was killed. Accounts suggest Griselda herself pulled the trigger, shooting him multiple times. In the gunfight, she too was wounded, but she survived. With Alberto Bravo dead, Griselda was once again alone at the top. She had eliminated her partner, seized full control of their empire, and proven that betrayal against her carried the ultimate price. After the killing of Bravo, New York became increasingly dangerous for her. Law enforcement pressure was closing in, and enemies lurked everywhere. It was at this moment that she made the decision that would define the next phase of her life. She left New York and moved her operations to Miami, Florida. Miami in the mid to late 1970s was a city on the edge of transformation, about to explode into the epicenter of America's cocaine epidemic. And Griselda Blanco was heading straight for it, ready to claim her throne as the Cocaine Godmother. When Griselda Blanco arrived in Miami in the late 1970s, she entered a city on the brink of transformation. Miami was still a sleepy resort town for retirees, tourists, and Cuban exiles, but beneath the surface, it was becoming fertile ground for the cocaine trade. Proximity to the Caribbean, a booming nightlife culture, and porous borders made it the perfect gateway for Colombian traffickers. And in this environment, Griselda saw not only opportunity, but destiny. Her relocation from New York was not a retreat, but a strategic move. In New York, law enforcement was cracking down, rivals were circling, and the DEA was tightening its grip. Miami, however, was open territory. It lacked the deeply entrenched mafia structures of New York, meaning she could carve out her empire without bending the knee to Italian families. For Griselda, it was a fresh canvas to paint her vision of power and domination. From the moment she arrived, she began organizing the infrastructure that would turn Miami into the cocaine capital of the world. Using her contacts in Medellín, she arranged steady shipments of cocaine, often transported by sea and air. Her innovation in smuggling was legendary. She expanded on her New York tactics, creating entire wardrobes of custom-made lingerie and clothing with hidden compartments. Women couriers, often young and desperate, were recruited to fly into Miami, carrying kilos of cocaine against their bodies. Some couriers carried drugs inside suitcases with false compartments, while others had cocaine sewn into children's clothing or stuffed inside dolls. Griselda's imagination in smuggling was boundless, and her ruthlessness ensured loyalty among those she recruited. As the cocaine trade grew, so did her wealth. She began to live like royalty, earning millions every month. Mansions in Miami, expensive cars, fine jewelry, and extravagant parties became part of her daily life. Yet beneath the glamour, there was always blood. Griselda Blanco's empire was built not only on cocaine, but on fear. Her rise in Miami coincided with a wave of violence that would later be known as the Cocaine Wars. Unlike other traffickers who preferred quiet deals and backroom arrangements, Griselda embraced violence as a business tool. She understood that fear was more powerful than negotiation. Rivals were not merely outmaneuvered, they were eliminated. Drive-by shootings, executions in broad daylight, and even massacres in crowded public places became trademarks of her reign. Miami newspapers began reporting a shocking increase in drug-related murders, and behind many of them stood her orders. Her reputation grew so fearsome that she was given the nickname that would define her legacy, La Madrina, the Godmother. In the male-dominated world of organized crime, this was extraordinary. While other women traffickers existed, none matched her scale, brutality, or command. She was both respected and hated, admired for her cunning, but feared for her ruthlessness. One of her most infamous methods of violence was the use of motorcycle assassins. Griselda popularized the tactic of sending killers on motorcycles to carry out hits in traffic or crowded areas, allowing them to escape quickly through Miami's streets. This method became a signature of the Cocaine Wars and a symbol of her influence on organized crime. Years later, irony would strike when she herself was killed in the exact same way. Her personal life during this era was as chaotic as her criminal one. After the death of Alberto Bravo, she remarried again, this time to Dario Sepulveda. With him she had another son, Michael Corleone Blanco, named after the infamous character from the Godfather movies. The name reflected not only her obsession with crime culture, but also her belief in her own destiny as a criminal monarch. Yet, like her previous relationships, this marriage was unstable. Griselda's violent temper and paranoia often made her personal relationships as dangerous as her business ones. But while her personal life spiraled, her empire continued to expand. By the late 1970s, Griselda controlled a significant share of the cocaine flowing into Miami. Conservative estimates suggest she was earning up to $80 million a month at the height of her power. Her reach extended from Miami to New York, Los Angeles, and beyond. She was no longer just a trafficker, she was an international kingpin, commanding one of the most sophisticated drug networks in the world. Her wealth gave her power, but it also drew attention. Miami police, the DEA, and federal prosecutors could no longer ignore the wave of violence and drugs flooding the city. Investigations began to target her organization, but Griselda remained elusive. She operated through layers of couriers, lieutenants, and middlemen, making it difficult for authorities to reach her directly. Her cunning kept her one step ahead of law enforcement, while her ruthlessness silenced potential informants. Yet her empire was not without cracks. Her use of violence, while effective in instilling fear, also created enemies everywhere. Rivals in Miami sought revenge, and even her allies began to fear that one day her paranoia would turn against them. Within her own organization, whispers of discontent grew louder, but for now, Griselda remained untouchable. By the close of the 1970s, the transformation was complete. The little girl from Medellín's slums had become the Cocaine Godmother of Miami. She ruled through fear, smuggling innovations, and an unrelenting hunger for power. The violence she unleashed turned Miami into one of the most dangerous cities in America, a place where bodies piled up in broad daylight and the streets echoed with gunfire. Griselda Blanco had declared herself a queenpin in a world of men, and no one dared to challenge her directly. But as the new decade approached, the violence she created would spiral even further, and the empire she built would become both her throne and her prison. The dawn of the 1980s brought Miami into a new era, one defined by blood, bullets, and cocaine. At the center of it all stood Griselda Blanco. By now, she was no longer just another Colombian trafficker. She was the most feared figure in the city's underworld. Miami's transformation into the cocaine capital of the United States was inseparable from her rise. But with her growing empire came an avalanche of violence, one that would shock America and forever etch her name into history as the Cocaine Godmother. The scale of her operations in Miami was staggering. Her network was moving tons of cocaine each month, much of it directly from Medellín. Planes, boats, and human couriers funneled the drug into Florida, where her distributors ensured it reached every corner of the United States. Cocaine was no longer a niche product for the wealthy. It had become mainstream, flooding nightclubs, college campuses, and Wall Street offices. Griselda Blanco was reaping the rewards, earning millions each week. But Miami's drug market was not hers alone. Rival traffickers, Colombian cartels, and Cuban gangs all fought for a piece of the pie. What separated Griselda from the rest was her willingness to use unrestrained violence to secure her territory. She didn't negotiate with rivals. She destroyed them. If another trafficker stepped into her market, she sent assassins. If a courier betrayed her, they disappeared. If a dealer owed her money, their family was often targeted as well. Her most notorious innovation during this era was the widespread use of motorcycle hitmen, known as sicarios. These assassins would ride two to a bike, one to drive, the other to shoot. They struck with precision in the middle of traffic or outside crowded businesses, then vanished before police could react. Griselda deployed this method so often that it became synonymous with Miami's cocaine violence. The tactic was so effective that rivals soon copied it, escalating the bloodshed even further. The most infamous example came in 1979, an event often cited as the spark of the Miami cocaine wars, the Dadeland Mall massacre. Griselda's men stormed a liquor store in the mall, armed with machine guns, and opened fire in broad daylight. The attack killed 2 people and injured several others, terrifying ordinary citizens. It was not just another underworld killing. It was a declaration of war in the middle of suburban Miami. The images of blood and shattered glass shocked the public and drew national attention to the scale of Miami's drug problem. From that point forward, the city became known as the murder capital of the United States. The violence only grew worse in the early 1980s. Drive-by shootings, home invasions, and assassinations became routine. Innocent bystanders were often caught in the crossfire. Hospitals reported skyrocketing numbers of gunshot victims and morgues filled with bodies. Law enforcement struggled to contain the chaos. Local police admitted they were outgunned and overwhelmed, while the DEA and FBI scrambled to piece together the networks flooding America with cocaine. At the heart of many investigations, one name kept appearing: Griselda Blanco. Her brutality was not limited to rivals and outsiders. Even within her organization, she ruled through terror. Disloyal lieutenants were executed, often in gruesome ways designed to send a message. Associates whispered that she ordered the killing of her own hitmen if they failed a job or displeased her. Her paranoia made her unpredictable, and those who worked closest to her lived in constant fear. Yet, despite the chaos, Griselda remained untouchable for a time. She insulated herself from direct dealings, rarely handled drugs personally, and operated through trusted intermediaries. Her ability to stay in the shadows frustrated law enforcement. Even when agents suspected her involvement in murders or major shipments, they lacked the evidence to bring charges. Her wealth during these years was beyond comprehension. Reports estimate she was earning up to $80 million a month at the height of her power. She indulged in luxury homes, expensive jewelry, and lavish parties. She surrounded herself with bodyguards, killers, and loyalists who enjoyed the spoils of her empire. Yet, for all her wealth, she trusted no one. She kept her children close, but grew increasingly paranoid that betrayal lurked around every corner. Her marriage to Dario Sepulveda, her third husband, was also collapsing. Dario resented her violent lifestyle and constant paranoia. Their relationship turned bitter, with violent arguments and mistrust on both sides. Eventually, Dario left her, taking their young son, Michael Corleone Blanco, back to Colombia. Griselda, unwilling to accept the loss, allegedly ordered his assassination. In 1983, Dario was gunned down in Medellín, and Michael was returned to her custody. It was yet another example of how nothing, not even family, stood in the way of her will. By now, Miami was drowning in bloodshed. The media coined the term cocaine cowboys to describe the era's traffickers and killers, but above them all stood the Godmother. She had not only participated in the violence, she had set the standard for it. Her name became synonymous with fear, and even hardened criminals hesitated before crossing her path. But her empire was not invincible. The same violence that secured her throne also attracted relentless attention. Federal agencies poured resources into Miami, determined to dismantle the networks responsible for the chaos. Undercover operations, wiretaps, and informants began to chip away at her organization. While Griselda remained hidden, her lieutenants and couriers became vulnerable. By 1983, the walls were closing in. Law enforcement had identified her as one of the central figures in Miami's drug epidemic. The DEA considered her one of the most dangerous traffickers in the world, and the pressure to bring her down intensified. Griselda Blanco had reached the peak of her power, but storm clouds were gathering. Her reign as the Cocaine Godmother of Miami was about to be challenged not only by law enforcement, but also by her own excesses. The violence that had secured her empire was now the very force unraveling it. By the early 1980s, Griselda Blanco had achieved what few in the criminal underworld could imagine. She was one of the richest and most powerful drug lords in the world, feared across 2 continents, and untouchable in Miami's bloody cocaine trade. But beneath the empire of smuggling routes, assassins, and millions of dollars, her personal life was a dark reflection of the same violence and paranoia that fueled her criminal career. Griselda Blanco was not simply a trafficker, she was the embodiment of ruthless ambition, and nowhere was that more evident than in how she lived and how she loved. Her reputation for brutality was unmatched. Unlike other traffickers who preferred to keep violence in the shadows, Griselda used it as a public demonstration of power. Stories circulated of how she would personally order executions, often with chilling creativity. Associates whispered about rivals being killed in their own homes, careers being tortured for mistakes, and even loyal lieutenants being executed if they displeased her. She demanded absolute loyalty, and to her, betrayal was not something to be punished. It was something to be erased permanently. One of her most infamous alleged acts of ruthlessness was tied not to business, but to her own home. Rumors claimed that Griselda once ordered the killing of a housemaid because she believed the woman had disrespected her young son. In another story, she allegedly hosted parties where she forced guests to use cocaine until they overdosed, watching coldly as their bodies collapsed. Whether every tale was fact or legend, they reflected the aura of fear she cultivated around herself. Her empire ran on cocaine, but its foundation was blood. Her relationships were equally defined by violence. By this time, she had already outlived 2 husbands, Carlos Trujillo, who vanished under mysterious circumstances, and Alberto Bravo, whom she personally gunned down in Bogota. Her third husband, Dario Sepulveda, met a similar fate when their marriage soared. Dario had grown tired of her paranoia and constant bloodshed, eventually taking their son Michael Corleone back to Colombia. To Griselda, this was not just betrayal, it was theft of her child. In 1983, Dario was ambushed and killed in Medellín, shot dead in front of Michael. The boy was returned to Griselda, and though she never admitted it, few doubted who had ordered the hit. For Griselda, love and loyalty were inseparable from control. She named her youngest son after Michael Corleone, the fictional mafia boss from The Godfather, revealing not just her obsession with crime culture, but also her belief in her own criminal dynasty. Her sons, Dixon, Uber, Osvaldo, and Michael, were raised in an environment of wealth, violence, and paranoia. They grew up surrounded by bodyguards and hitmen, accustomed to luxury, but also haunted by the constant threat of enemies. For Griselda, her children were both heirs to her empire and tools in her quest for power. She involved them in the business as they grew older, ensuring that her bloodline would continue her legacy. But her paranoia extended even to her family. She trusted no one fully, not even those closest to her. Associates recounted how she would change homes frequently, moving from one mansion to another to avoid assassination attempts. She surrounded herself with heavily armed guards and demanded absolute secrecy from her inner circle. Yet even with all her precautions, her enemies continued to multiply. Her personal indulgences revealed another side of her ruthlessness, greed without limits. Griselda was infamous for her lavish spending. She bought extravagant mansions in Miami, filled them with gold-plated furniture, expensive art, and luxury cars. She reportedly held shopping sprees in designer boutiques, spending tens of thousands of dollars at a time. But her spending was not just about wealth. It was about power. She wanted to show the world that she, a woman from the slums of Medellín, had risen to heights that even male drug lords envied. Despite her wealth, she was never at peace. She lived in constant fear of betrayal and assassination. Every phone call, every meeting, every visitor was a potential threat. Her paranoia became so intense that she trusted only a small handful of people, many of whom were killers she had personally tested through violence. She demanded proof of loyalty through action, and once someone earned her trust, they often remained by her side until either death or prison claimed them. The paradox of Griselda's life was that even as she ruled one of the most violent criminal empires of her time, she still sought love and companionship, but her relationships inevitably ended in blood. She was a woman who could never separate her personal life from her business. For her, they were one and the same. Her ruthlessness also extended to how she viewed the future. She envisioned building a dynasty where her children would inherit her empire, just as the Italian mafia passed power through bloodlines. But unlike the mafia, her organization lacked structure and tradition. It was built on her personality, her fearsome reputation, and her willingness to kill without hesitation. That made her empire powerful in the short term, but fragile in the long run. By the mid-1980s, her brutality was both her strength and her weakness. On one hand, it secured her power and kept rivals terrified. On the other, it attracted relentless attention from law enforcement and created enemies everywhere. Every corpse left behind in Miami's streets brought her closer to the crosshairs of the DEA. Every betrayal punished with bullets tightened the noose around her empire. Griselda Blanco's personal life was not a sanctuary from her crimes. It was a mirror of them. Her marriages ended in blood, her children grew up in fear, and her luxuries were built on rivers of cocaine and death. She was ruthless in business, ruthless in love, and ruthless even in motherhood. The Cocaine Godmother was not just a title, it was her identity. As Miami's cocaine wars raged on, Griselda's reign became a symbol of both fear and excess. But the very traits that made her unstoppable, her violence, her paranoia, her hunger for control, would soon draw the full weight of law enforcement against her. The Godmother had ruled Miami through terror, but every empire of blood eventually faces its reckoning. By 1983, the violence in Miami had reached levels that shocked even seasoned law enforcement. Drive-by shootings, machine gun attacks, and bodies in the streets had become part of daily life. Hospitals overflowed with gunshot victims, and morgues filled faster than they could process the dead. At the center of this chaos, one name kept surfacing: Griselda Blanco. She had become a shadowy legend, the woman responsible for unleashing the cocaine wars. For the Drug Enforcement Administration and the FBI, it was no longer just about cocaine. It was about stopping the Godmother. The DEA had already been monitoring Colombian traffickers since the early 1970s, but the Dadeland Mall massacre in 1979 and the wave of killings that followed made Blanco a top priority. She wasn't just another smuggler. She was the architect of much of Miami's bloodshed, and her empire was feeding cocaine into every major American city. She had become what the FBI labeled a Category 1 target, the highest level of threat to U.S. national security in the war on drugs. But arresting Griselda was no simple task. She rarely handled drugs herself, avoided phone conversations that could be tapped, and moved constantly between safe houses. She used multiple layers of couriers, distributors, and lieutenants to shield herself from direct involvement. Her security detail was made up of heavily armed sicarios who would kill without hesitation to protect her. For years, law enforcement had struggled to gather enough hard evidence to bring her down. The breakthrough came through patient, methodical investigation. Agents began flipping her couriers and mid-level distributors, offering reduced sentences in exchange for information. One by one, pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Surveillance teams tracked drug shipments, wiretaps caught incriminating conversations, and undercover agents infiltrated her networks. The violence that had kept her feared also worked against her. Many associates, terrified of being her next victim, were willing to talk to investigators when given protection. By 1984, the DEA had assembled a strong case. They linked Griselda to dozens of shipments of cocaine worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They tied her to murders carried out by her organization, and they knew she was still hiding in the United States, even as many of her lieutenants were being arrested. The challenge was finding her. Griselda had gone underground. She no longer flaunted her wealth publicly, no longer hosted lavish parties, or moved through Miami's streets with the same arrogance. She was a fugitive in plain sight, hiding in modest homes, often under assumed identities. She knew the DEA and FBI were closing in, but her arrogance told her she could outsmart them. After all, she had survived betrayals, assassinations, and wars. She believed she could survive law enforcement too. The investigation culminated in February 1985. Acting on intelligence, a joint DEA and Miami-Dade Police Task Force tracked her to a house in Irvine, California, far from the chaos of Miami. It was a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where no one would expect to find the most dangerous woman in the Western Hemisphere. But inside that modest house, Griselda Blanco was hiding with her youngest son. The raid was swift and precise. Agents surrounded the home, cut off escape routes, and stormed inside. Griselda was caught off guard. For years, she had lived under the assumption that her killers would come on motorcycles, guns blazing. Instead, it was federal agents who appeared at her door. There was no shootout, no dramatic final stand. She was arrested without resistance, a queenpin brought down not by rivals, but by the slow, relentless hand of justice. Her capture made headlines across the country. The media portrayed her as the Black Widow, the woman who killed her husbands, the Cocaine Godmother, who ruled Miami with an iron fist. To the public, she was both a monster and a fascination. A female kingpin who had shattered the expectations of organized crime. For law enforcement, her arrest was a victory in the escalating war on drugs, proof that even the most elusive traffickers could be caught. But even in custody, Griselda remained dangerous. Prosecutors prepared cases linking her to multiple murders and massive cocaine shipments. Witnesses were placed under heavy protection, knowing that her reach could extend even from behind bars. Agents feared that her loyalists would attempt assassinations of informants or even try to break her out of prison. The full weight of the federal government was brought against her, determined to keep her locked away. Her empire, however, began to collapse in her absence. Without her ruthless control, rival traffickers moved in to seize her territory. The Medellín Cartel, led by figures like Pablo Escobar and the Alcoa brothers, filled the vacuum she left behind. Where she once ruled Miami, new players emerged, hungrier and better organized. Griselda had been a pioneer of the cocaine trade, but by the mid-1980s, she was a prisoner while others carried her legacy forward. Yet even as she sat in custody, her legend grew. Stories of her killings, her smuggling methods, and her violent paranoia spread through newspapers, television, and whispers in the underworld. She became a symbol, the woman who brought Miami to its knees, the ruthless matriarch of cocaine. For the DEA and FBI, her arrest was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a long legal battle. Griselda faced charges of conspiracy to manufacture, import, and distribute cocaine. The government was determined to make an example of her, to show the world that no drug lord, not even the Cocaine Godmother, was beyond reach. By 1985, the era of her reign was over. The woman who once commanded armies of killers, who flooded America with cocaine, who ruled Miami with terror, was now reduced to a prisoner in federal custody. But even behind bars, the shadow of Griselda Blanco loomed large. She had redefined what it meant to be a drug lord, and her story was far from finished when federal agents led Griselda Blanco out of her suburban safe house in California in 1985. It marked the end of her reign in Miami and the beginning of a long chapter behind bars. For a woman who had lived by violence, power, and constant motion, prison was a cage unlike any she had ever faced. Yet even locked away, the Cocaine Godmother remained a force to be reckoned with, her legend only growing as her empire crumbled outside. Griselda was charged with conspiracy to manufacture, import, and distribute cocaine. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses, including former lieutenants and couriers, lined up to testify against her. Some did so out of revenge, others in exchange for lighter sentences, and many simply because they feared ending up on her hit list if they refused. Prosecutors portrayed her as the mastermind behind Miami's blood-soaked cocaine wars, responsible for countless murders and millions of dollars in smuggled drugs. The courtroom became a theater where Griselda's reputation as the Cocaine Godmother was cemented. The prosecution detailed her smuggling routes, her extravagant lifestyle, and her ruthless violence. Jurors heard about the Dadeland Mall massacre, drive-by shootings, and the execution of rivals. They heard about the way she raised her children in an environment of guns and cocaine, and about her cold, calculated elimination of her husbands. Every story reinforced the image of a woman who had ruled through blood and fear, In 1985, she was convicted on drug charges and sentenced to more than a decade in federal prison. For most, such a sentence would have meant a retreat into obscurity, but for Griselda, it was another stage upon which her myth grew. Even from behind bars, she carried herself with the same aura of authority she had commanded on the streets. Guards and inmates alike knew her name. Her prison years were far from quiet. Incarceration did not strip her of influence. Through coded messages, visitors, and loyal associates, she continued to wield some degree of control over her remaining networks. Though diminished, her connections in Miami and Colombia did not vanish overnight. In fact, her notoriety gave her a certain protection within prison walls. Many inmates feared her, and others admired her as a figure who had outsmarted men in a world dominated by them. But Griselda also faced setbacks behind bars. Prosecutors sought to charge her with multiple murders committed during her reign. Witnesses prepared to testify, and some of the most damning evidence pointed directly to her involvement in killings. The government believed they finally had a chance to hold her accountable not just for drugs, but for blood. Yet in the 1990s, one of the most dramatic legal twists of her life unfolded. Key witnesses were either discredited, refused to testify, or were eliminated in suspicious circumstances. At one point, a star witness's credibility was destroyed when it was revealed he had engaged in misconduct while under government protection. The collapse of these cases meant that the most serious charges, the murders that could have kept her behind bars for life, never stuck. Griselda had once again slipped through the cracks, not through violence this time, but through the flaws of the justice system. Still, she remained imprisoned on drug charges, serving nearly 2 decades in custody. During this time, her empire outside continued to deteriorate. The Medellín Cartel, once her ally and competitor, fell apart after Pablo Escobar's death in 1993. Other cartels, particularly from Mexico, began to dominate the drug trade. Griselda's era was over. Her empire dismantled piece by piece while she sat in a cell, powerless to stop it. Her personal life during prison was marked by tragedy. Her 3 elder sons, Dixon Uber and Osvaldo, who had followed her footsteps into the drug trade, were all murdered in Colombia and the United States during the 1990s. Each killing was a reminder that the world she had built was devouring her family. Only her youngest son, Michael Corleone, survived, shielded from the violence by his youth and his eventual distance from the cartel lifestyle. The losses weighed heavily on her, but if Griselda felt sorrow, she rarely showed it. To those around her, she remained cold, hardened, and unbroken. In prison, she aged but did not soften. Reports describe her as maintaining a quiet but commanding presence. She was not the wild, flamboyant queenpin of Miami anymore. Instead, she was a woman who understood that her time had passed, but whose name still carried weight. Inmates whispered her stories, and guards treated her with wary respect. Even without guns or money, she was dangerous in reputation alone. By the early 2000s, her time was nearly up. After serving nearly 19 years, Griselda Blanco was released in 2004. For a woman who had once controlled millions of dollars, fleets of smugglers, and armies of killers, she walked out of prison into a very different world. The drug trade had changed, her family was shattered, and her enemies were still waiting. Her release sparked widespread debate. Some feared she would return to crime, reigniting old networks and unleashing more violence. Others believed she was a relic of a bygone era, too old and too exposed to ever rebuild her empire. For Griselda herself, freedom was bittersweet. She had survived prison, but she had lost her sons, her empire, and the life of absolute power she once craved. Still, Survival was something she had mastered since childhood. Prison had not broken her spirit. If anything, it reinforced her identity. She was the Cocaine Godmother, and even in defeat, her story was not yet finished. When Griselda Blanco walked out of prison in 2004, she was no longer the feared queenpin of Miami's cocaine trade. The woman who had once orchestrated massacres and controlled millions was now in her 60s, frail from age and time behind bars. Yet even after nearly 2 decades in prison, she remained one of the most infamous figures in the history of organized crime. Her release drew headlines across the United States and Colombia. Reporters called her the Cocaine Godmother, the Black Widow, and the first queen of narco trafficking. But the world Griselda returned to was not the one she had left. The Medellín cartel that had once dominated cocaine production was long gone. Pablo Escobar had been killed in 1993. The Cali cartel had collapsed in the late 1990s. By the 2000s, new cartels from Mexico, like the Sinaloa Federation and Los Zetas, controlled the drug routes into the United States. For the first time in her life, Griselda was no longer relevant to the game she had once helped create. Upon her release, she was deported back to Colombia. Some believed she would attempt to re-enter the drug trade, but those fears never materialized. Griselda, once feared for her ruthlessness, seemed content to live in quiet obscurity. She settled in Medellín, the same city where her story had begun more than 6 decades earlier. But while her days of commanding armies of hitmen were over, her reputation followed her everywhere. In the streets, people still whispered her name. For younger generations of traffickers, she was a legend, a pioneer who had blazed the path they now walked. Her final years were a strange contradiction. On the surface, Griselda lived quietly. She avoided the limelight, rarely appearing in public, and surrounded herself with family, particularly her youngest son, Michael Corleone Blanco. After losing her 3 older sons to the violence of the drug trade, Michael became her only surviving child. She was deeply protective of him, perhaps realizing that her empire had cost her too much. For the first time, it seemed as if Griselda wanted peace. Yet peace was something that had never existed in her world. The enemies she had made over decades were countless, and in Medellín, grudges were not forgotten. Many of her rivals, families of her victims, and even surviving associates carried memories of betrayal, blood, and loss tied to her name. Though she tried to fade into the background, Griselda Blanco could never truly escape the past. In those final years, she was said to spend much of her time at home, occasionally venturing out with little of the security she had once demanded. Gone were the bodyguards, the armored cars, and the luxury estates. The Cocaine Godmother now lived in relative modesty, often traveling with only a single driver or family member. Some speculated that she believed her notoriety would protect her, that at her age, no one would bother to settle old scores. Others thought she had grown tired of paranoia and simply accepted that death would come when it came. On September 3, 2012, death finally did come. Griselda Blanco was 70 years old when she walked into a butcher shop in Medellín with her pregnant daughter-in-law. It was an ordinary errand, one that countless people made every day. But for Griselda, there were no ordinary moments. As she stepped back outside, a man on a motorcycle approached. Without hesitation, he pulled out a pistol and fired 2 shots into her head. The hit was carried out in the very style Griselda herself had once perfected, the motorcycle drive-by. It was a method of assassination she had introduced to Miami decades earlier, when her sicarios would ride through the streets with fuses blazing. Now, in a dark twist of fate, she died by her own invention. the godmother of cocaine was executed in broad daylight, her blood pooling on the pavement just steps from the shop. Her assassin escaped into the Medellín traffic, leaving behind a scene that was both shocking and inevitable. For years, it had been whispered that Griselda would not die in peace. Too many enemies had been left alive. Too many families still sought vengeance. For them, her death was not just an ending but a reckoning. News of her assassination spread rapidly. Across Colombia and the United States, headlines blared, "Cocaine Godmother killed in Medellín." Commentators noted the irony of her death, gunned down in the same brutal fashion she had unleashed on others. For many it felt like justice delayed but finally served. For others, it was simply the closing chapter of one of the bloodiest careers in organized crime. Her funeral was a quiet affair compared to the chaos of her life. Family members attended, including Michael, who would later build his own small fame by capitalizing on his mother's notorious legacy. To some in Medellín, her death was just another statistic in a city still scarred by violence. To others, it was the symbolic end of an era, the final curtain on the cocaine wars that had reshaped Miami, Colombia, and the global drug trade. Griselda's assassination also raised questions that remain unanswered. Who ordered the hit? Was it a rival cartel seeking revenge? Was it a family avenging a murder from decades earlier? Or was it simply a young sicario looking to make a name by killing one of history's most infamous criminals? No one was ever arrested. Her murder, like so many she had ordered, vanished into the silence of unsolved cases. In the years after her death, her legend only grew. Documentaries, books, and films revisited her story, painting her as both a monster and a pioneer. She was remembered as the woman who proved that gender was no barrier in the drug world, who built an empire of blood, and who died by the very violence she had created. Her final years were quiet, but her ending was loud. A gunshot on the streets of Medellín, echoing through history. For Griselda Blanco, there was never going to be a peaceful death in bed or a gentle fading into old age. Her life had been written in blood, and it was only fitting that it ended the same way. Griselda Blanco's death in 2012 closed one of the bloodiest chapters in the history of organized crime, but her story did not end on the Medellín street where she was gunned down. In many ways, her assassination marked only the beginning of her transformation into legend. Today, her name continues to echo across documentaries, news reports, books, and popular culture. To understand her legacy, one must look at both the destruction she caused and the imprint she left on the world of crime. Griselda's impact on the drug trade is undeniable. Long before Pablo Escobar became the face of Colombian trafficking, she was already moving tons of cocaine into the United States. She pioneered smuggling methods that others would later copy. From using false, bottomed suitcases and hidden compartments to recruiting an army of couriers, many of them women, to carry drugs on commercial flights. She was among the first to understand the vast profit potential of cocaine and among the first to build large-scale distribution networks in Miami, New York, and Los Angeles. In many ways, she laid the groundwork for the multi-billion-dollar cartels that would dominate after her fall. But her legacy is not one of innovation alone. It is one of violence. Griselda Blanco turned Miami into a war zone. The cocaine wars of the late 1970s and early 1980s left hundreds dead and reshaped the city's reputation. Once seen as a sunny tourist paradise, Miami became known as the murder capital of America. The drive by motorcycle assassinations that became her signature filled headlines and terrorized communities. Even seasoned law enforcement officers were stunned by the level of brutality her organization unleashed. That violence became a blueprint for others, spreading beyond Miami into the broader cartel wars that later engulfed Colombia and Mexico. Her influence also extended to culture. Griselda was one of the few women in a world dominated by men, and she not only survived but thrived. She controlled an empire, ordered the deaths of rivals, and commanded respect through fear. For this reason, she has been portrayed in contradictory ways. To some, she is a feminist icon of twisted empowerment, proof that a woman could break into the male-dominated ranks of organized crime. To others, she is a monster, a cautionary tale of unchecked ambition and cruelty. In truth, she was both, a figure who shattered gender barriers, but at the cost of countless lives. Her legend has been retold through countless forms of media. Documentaries like Cocaine Cowboys brought her story to new audiences. Books chronicled her rise and fall, painting her as the Godmother who invented many of the tactics later made infamous by Escobar and others. In 2018, actress Catherine Zeta-Jones portrayed her in the TV film Cocaine Godmother, while Netflix released its own dramatization of her life years later. Through these depictions, she has been mythologized as much as remembered, her crimes transformed into stories of dark glamour. But beyond the media, Griselda's real legacy is measured in blood and grief. Entire families were destroyed by the wars she waged. Innocent bystanders were caught in the crossfire of her assassins. Communities in both Miami and Medellín were left scarred by the violence she unleashed. The money she generated fueled corruption, empowered other traffickers, and deepened the cycle of addiction in the United States. For all her notoriety, her empire left behind little more than pain. Her personal legacy is equally tragic. Of her 4 sons, 3 were killed in the very underworld she created. Dixon, Uber, and Osvaldo were all murdered during the 1990s. Only her youngest, Michael Corleone Blanco, survived. After her death, Michael sought to capitalize on her infamy, launching a clothing line called Pure Blanco and appearing in reality television shows. To some, this was exploitation of a bloody past. To others, it was simply survival, the only way for a son to carve out a future from the shadow of a mother who had cast her name across history. In Colombia, her story remains both infamous and symbolic. Medellín, once defined by its drug lords, has since tried to reinvent itself, but the memory of figures like Griselda Blanco is impossible to erase. Her assassination was viewed by many Colombians as poetic justice, a violent end for a woman who had spread so much violence herself. Yet among some in the barrios where she first rose, she is remembered almost with a strange respect, a poor girl who clawed her way to power in a world stacked against her. Globally, her story feeds into the larger narrative of the drug trade. She was one of the first to prove that cocaine could be trafficked on a massive scale, and her innovations became the foundation for the cartels that followed. The violence she normalized set the stage for decades of bloodshed in Latin America. Even in death, her shadow lingers in the tactics and brutality of modern cartels. Ultimately, Griselda Blanco's legacy is one of contradictions. She was both a pioneer and a destroyer, a woman who built an empire and destroyed countless lives. She was a mother who named her son after a mafia boss, then outlived almost all of her children. She was a queen who ended her days not in luxury, but on a sidewalk, killed in the same fashion she had once ordered so many others to die. Her impact cannot be denied. Griselda Blanco changed the drug trade forever. She changed Miami, she changed Medellín, and she changed the way the world understood organized crime. But she also serves as a reminder that empires built on blood cannot last. Power won through fear eventually collapses, and legends of violence end in violence. The Cocaine Godmother remains one of the most infamous criminals in modern history. Her name still inspires fascination, revulsion, and awe. But her true legacy is not the empire she built or the myths she inspired. Her true legacy is the trail of destruction she left behind. A legacy written not in gold or glory, but in blood.